So yes, I would be presenting our work on quantifying the carbon footprint of a metropolitan food system. So the motivation behind this project stems from the fact that climate change, urbanization, and our perceived urgency of the need for change is threatening our global food supply. And studies have shown that our food system produces about 20 to 30% of all anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. And you'll see later in my presentation that a lot of that emissions can be avoided if we wasted less food. And this project is to help us better understand the intricacies of an urban food system. So our food system can be summarized into the following stages and substages. Each substage is what we consider a broad food activity. So in the production stage, we have agricultural production, secondary processing, and packaging. Next, in transportation happens throughout the system between sources and to destination. And once the food gets to the destination, shipping occurs between wholesalers and retailers and between retailers and households. Storage is mainly refrigeration that occurred during each stage. And we have energy use of cooking at home and in restaurants. And finally, we have avoidable and unavoidable food waste and waste disposal. So existing literature covers pretty much each stage of our food system. So in production, we have studied the environmental impacts of agricultural processes. And in transportation, studies have been done on long and short distance food distribution. In storage, refrigeration emissions have been studied intensely, I would say, and in consumption, we see that diets can affect food demand at the source. And we also know the impact of different food waste and disposal methods. However, the LCA methods used and regions studied are too broad and too diverse to really tell us the total emissions from one specific food system. So our contribution would be to link all the steps previously mentioned and to estimate the carbon footprint of one regional food system. So we want to identify a potential framework for such calculations that could be fairly easily adapted to different regions of study. And we want to give policymakers a concrete backing of data that show where their food system is most vulnerable. And we want to clearly show where the policies could be targeted to reduce and mitigate emissions from our food systems. And so our ultimate goal for this project is to do all of the above for one regional food system. So the overarching idea used to calculate food system emissions is to find the amount of food that go through each food activity, find the emissions factor of that activity, and then some overall food activities. So the greatest uncertainty comes from the estimate of the total amount of food consumed in a region. So we developed 4 different methods for comparison. So to know the total emissions, we need to know the total amount of food that is eaten and wasted in the region. And we have 3 main data sources to give us such an estimate. So the first is local data, and this is food sales records of a local grocery store. So the benefit of this source is that it has high spatial resolution. The next 2 methods fall under higher level public sources, one of which is the Freight Analysis Framework, or FAF. It is a database where all shipping records into, out of, and within the US is recorded. So these aren't by trip, but it's a summary of data when you select the criteria you want. So for this study, our criteria is imported and exported food from our local region, which is roughly 3 different cities around Pittsburgh. The benefit of FAF is that it's very high level and it collects data from the actual sources. Next, we have national and international food surveys. And they can give us an average consumption of different foods. And these surveys are highly referenced and trusted. And then finally, we used a range of sources, including the three mentioned just now, to perform a more detailed life cycle analysis of how food streams through each stage of the system. So I will now go over these methods of calculating the total amount of food consumed in more detail. So the first method was using the Freight Analysis Framework database, and we can calculate for each broader food category how much food is imported into and exported from the region. But one flaw in this method is that we don't really know the amount of locally produced food that is also consumed locally, because FAF only counts shipments that cross regional borders. And in method 2, we used data from a local grocery store, which for each item sold, we multiplied the quantities sold by its unit weight and summed across all items, and we scaled this up by the store's local market share. And the third method is perhaps the most commonly used one and the most straightforward. We just used survey data to calculate how much food one person consumes in a year, and then scaled that up by population to get total food for the region. And the fourth method combines various data sources, including sources from the previous methods, and we find the amount of food that goes through each stage of the food system. And for each stage, we find the amount of food that is wasted during transportation. And we can add that up to get our total food consumed in the region. So we applied these methods to a case study of Allegheny County, where the city of Pittsburgh resides, and Pittsburgh's population is about a quarter of the county's. So using the four methods, we found a range of results. So the FAF gave us a really high number compared to the other three methods, partly due to its fairly low spatial resolution. And the region that Pittsburgh lies in also includes a large portion of agricultural land that likely exports a lot of food that is not being counted. So using the results from our combined method, we calculate that Allegheny County residents purchase around 1.25 million metric tons of food per year. And this includes bottled beverages, but it does not include weight of packaging. And this averages to about a kilo of food per meal. 27% of food purchased end up wasted, although some of it is unavoidable waste, like fruit peel and animal bones. And Allegheny County's food system produces about 3.7 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent annually, and this is about 3.1 metric tons per resident, which is comparable to driving 8,000 miles. When we compare the amount eaten versus the amount emitted, we see the disparity between carbon intensive and relatively environmentally friendly foods. So by weight, we consume less than 5% beef, but it takes up over a third of total emissions. And we can summarize the flow of emissions in a Sankey diagram where the black numbers denote emissions from previous streams, and the red numbers denote additional emissions that occur at that stream. So on the left-hand side, we have embodied production emissions from each food, and the foods go through the system where after each stage, a little more emissions is accumulated. And most of that additional emissions comes from storage, transportation, and waste disposal. And on the right-hand side, we see the source of emissions, where embodied emissions from production accounts for the majority. Another important takeaway from this is that embodied emissions in food waste, and this just means that if we didn't produce the food we wasted, we could have avoided over a quarter of all embodied emissions. And this is just a summary of sources of emissions. 71% comes from production, and this includes food that's wasted. And the next highest is storage at 18%, and then transportation at 7%, and then finally waste disposal accounts for 4%. So we want to reflect on our data sources. So as I've mentioned in method 1, FAF shipping records does not account for food produced locally that is also consumed locally. And there really is no other data source like the FAF. It's a great source for showing material flow in the US, but for our purposes, we may require higher spatial resolution. And in method 2, grocery store sales records are sometimes measured by quantity instead of weight. So we ended up with a range of product weights. And in method 3, the food survey gave us limited information on local diet habits, and that could vary a lot with location. So we don't really know how that differs from the average. So despite the uncertainties in our data sources, we can still make a few high-level policy implications from our results. First, we saw that emissions are from most of the emissions are from embodied emissions during production. So we want to reduce the amount of carbon-intensive foods eaten. And we can do this by helping residents curb high-meat diets and promote healthy eating by starting in schools. And then next, we want to reduce the amount of avoidable food waste to reduce wasting all that embodied emissions. And we could do this by getting excess food into the hands of people who need them. And last but not the least, we want to reduce emissions from storage, and we can do this by reducing the amount of food spent, the amount of time food spent being refrigerated through better planning. And we want residents and restaurants and stores to upgrade their low efficiency storage units. So our next steps are to calculate reduction potential for different policies, and we want to do a few local surveys on eating and shopping habits, as well as food equity indicators, and we want to ultimately optimize food equity by considering demographics and help cities build more sustainable food systems. So to conclude, I talked about the 4 methods that we use to calculate the total amount of food eaten and wasted in a specific region, where we also saw how different methods capture different strengths of different data sources. And in general, more localized data can help us reduce the uncertainty in our results. And in Allegheny County, we eat and waste about 2.5 million metric tons of food per year and emit 7 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. And finally, our results point to policy windows in reducing the amount of carbon-intensive food eaten, reducing food waste, and improving storage methods. So that's all. Thank you so much for listening.